so let's review an example of using several of these tricks we've learned and look at some do's and don'ts. Let's do the same kind of thing we were doing before, but let's start with a set of numbers. Let's start with, for example, we'll just take number, we'll make a label, and we'll go 0, and we'll say equals this plus 1, and then we'll pull this down and we'll get 10 numbers here. So now we go from 0 to 10, and let's say we wanted to have the angle that went from 0 to pi. So we put in theta, this is our label. And so how would we go from 0 to pi? Well, one way would be to use the pi function, which exists. So we can say that this is equal to the trial number times pi. In this case, that doesn't have an argument, but you have to tell it it's a function, not a label, times 0.1. And so now if I pull this down, remember double clicking on it will bring it all the way down. I go from 0 to exactly pi. And again, maybe that's a little bit more digits than I want, so I can say decrease, and then I can go to 3.142 for pi. So now if I wanted to do the cosine of, let's say, pi, I can do cos of theta, my label. I can say equals, and I may not remember the cosine function, but it just cos of, and I put in that cell there, and that's the cosine, which is 1, and I double click it, and I get all the way down from 1 back to 1, which is my cosine. So do's and don'ts. Never type a series of numbers if you can use a formula to make those numbers, which is what we did here. We typed our first number, and then we used a formula. So if I change this number, if I made this, for example, 3, and hit enter, then my numbers would start in a different place, and I would get a different cycle. That's part of the power of the spreadsheet, is by changing a single number, I can change all of the calculations are redone. I go back to 0, I go back to where I was before. So the idea is never type these numbers, use a formula to connect them. Don't type the cell number, although you can type it by doing, you could type the cell number if you wanted to, but you're always better off pointing at it because you don't make a mistake. Another way to do this, you see I had pi in each of these formulas here. So if I look up here and I click, I had each formula says f, in this case, f10 times pi. How could I have done it differently? Well, one way I could have done it differently is, let me hit escape here. I could have put pi here and then said equals pi, and there's pi. And now in this formula here, I could have retyped this as, let me just retype this formula. And instead of putting pi here, I could have said times this number. But I need to fix that number because pi is not going to move when I change the formula. So if I put Command T here on Mac or F4 on a Windows machine, it will fix that. And then if I copy this formula all the way down, I don't see a change, but if I look at any one individual formula here, what I see is the formula changes. It says F10 in this case times G6 times star, and I can do that in any of these, and you can see that the G6 remains the same in each of these. So that's how I used fixed cells. So here's an example of some of the tricks you can use for doing simple things in Excel. One more trick. What if I wanted to move this entire thing around? I'd say, well, what happens if I try to move a block and everything references this fixed pi and these go to the cell next to it? So copying moves things by chain transformation. Moving doesn't. So if I highlight a whole group here and say I want to move this thing, if I put my little thing up here, I get a hand rather than a plus sign. I can drag this and move it to someplace else, and the entire thing moves, and it knows to move the fixed cells correctly and to move the formulas correctly. So moving is different than copying. Anyway, here's some examples of how to use Excel.